time to dissect your favorite cartoons in animation dissection. Today I am here with Zorak, of course,
I'm voiced by Norio Wakamoto.
the best kind of voice. So, in lieu of doing animation news, we are going to go right into the topic today, and it's going to be Aim for the Top, Gunbuster, otherwise known as Topo Nerae Gunbuster. So, this one I went into fairly blind, which I think was kind of what you were hoping me to do
Sure,
for this one. So I'm going to leave the background data to Zorak today.
sure. Gunbuster is a OVA by Studio Gainax. Gainax you may know as being the studio behind Evangelion, Gurren Lagann, that sort of stuff. We previously watched another work by them called Nadia, The Secret of Blue Water, which I believe this actually predates. This does have some connections similar to Nadia, as it was one of the inspirations, or there's certain elements of that end up being used in Evangelion, as with kind of tied into the whole fact that Evangelion is a super derivative work. But anyways, it's directed by Hideaki Anno, who is the big Studio Gainax fellow. Was written by several other folks just within there, and basically was kind of they eventually brought actually Anno on to this existing sort of concept for the project. After the fact, it was how they kind of got Anno, I believe, into actually working for Gainax, I think.
Hmm.
And the production history for it was just kind of an OVA that was released over the course of, I think, about a year. They released some of the episodes within a pretty tight packaging, and then they released the other last two episodes after like 6 months. And there's quite a bit of animation variety throughout it. The style changes not hugely throughout, but the animation gets considerably better as it goes on,
Definitely.
particularly with the fidelity.
Yeah, and I think directorially it also kind of gets better as it goes along too.
Sure. The big thing with this is that it's actually a parody, in a kind of an odd thing. It's a parody of a tennis anime from the 1970s called Aim for the Ace, which is kind of the stereotypical shoujo-esque kind of actually aimed at boys type, sports thing of, you've got the girl who's not very good at tennis who's trying real hard, and, there's the girl that everybody looks up to, they call her One-sama, she's so good, and oh wait, the two people selected for the sports team are One-sama and the shitty newbie, because the coached character believes that she's got it in her to be a perfect champion, to be even better than the other one. They took that concept and then replaced it with like a space opera type struggle for existence against an alien menace.
So basically, they took tennis and replaced it with lasers and death.
Sure, it's very inspired by that. Why am I blanking on it? The Heinlein story, Starship Troopers. Like the intro is kind of like
Aha.
tennis anime plus Starship Troopers. There's some sequences in there that are actually kind of taken either directly from the tennis thing that's parodying Aim for the Ace, or taking from Starship Troopers with like the difficulty in piloting the robots and whatnot. It's a so do we want to go into just like a kind of covering the plot, or do you just want to go into the elements of it a bit?
Um, let's start with the plot, I think, because
Sure.
it's it's kind of interesting in a certain way, and then other ways it's very dumb. And
Yes.
I'm not
It,
sure how I want to tackle this. So, like the
sure.
basic plot, as you pretty much had already outlined in your description of this tennis anime, is that there is a in this case there is a kind of, at least at the beginning, a somewhat unseen alien force.
Hmm.
And actually, for quite a while in the series, you don't even see what they even look like until something like the fourth episode out of
Uh,
six.
well, you see them like on episode, I think 3-ish, where they have the thing where they have the captured specimen.
Yeah, but I mean, like otherwise they're kind of blurry. Like you don't really
Sure.
see them in battle though
No.
until that time. Like even then, they're like just like a red blur for the most part in
Yeah,
that
because they're going.
episode.
So they really call attention to like these things are fucking crazy as shit, and they're fast, and we're screwed,
Yeah, there's a lot of light speed going on here, and all the accompanying physics that go along with that.
so to speak.
Um, it reminds that a lot of that stuff reminds me of that what was it called? Voices of a Distant Star.
Yes.
It has a little bit of that, although this, of course, came way before. This is '80s as hell. Um, And so what they have is it starts off as this kind of oddly provincial thing where it's a girls' school in Okinawa where they are training to become like pilots, and I guess only two of them get to go, and every year, I guess, and they get sent to space.
Mhm.
Or maybe not every year, but I guess in this case, just two of them are being selected to go into space
Yep.
on this project.
And
And
so
the
the main character is I believe Noriko Takaya, who's
mhm.
most notable for the fact that her father was a admiral as part of like the space fleet that had at first encountered the aliens and was completely annihilated essentially, except for like, I think basically one survivor who is the coach of the two main characters. Who interestingly his first name is basically just Kochiro, Coach Oda.
Yeah,
So it's like double coach kind of going
Koichiro,
on.
Coach Oda. Yeah, it's
And they just everybody just calls him Kochi.
and of course that's not the worst of the names, as we'll get to eventually. But then you have the One-sama, the one that they all love, Kazumi Amano, who's
Yep.
basically pretty much just sounds like and acts like an adult from even like this time.
Mhm.
And she's pretty much like kind of perfect in every way and all that
She's so
type of
cool
stuff.
headed at all
Yeah.
times. Kind of feel it fitting into like the shojo tropes of there always being a not explicitly sort of a lesbian thing going on, but kind of that sort of thing going on
Yeah,
of
the kind of
towards
looking up to respectability type of thing.
yep, and
But
with
being expressed through very romantic terms.
sure, absolutely,
Yeah.
and essentially that the whole thing is that Noriko enters this thing because she wants to sort of avenge or actually find her father at this point, because she believes there might be some small hope that he could somehow be alive out there in space. And part of the reason why why that's the case, even though he actually died like 5 years ago, is the fact that the anime really goes into deep, particularly on the physics of relativity, though its execution is not great in terms of time dilation. So
And
that's
also it's hard for me with this one because in particular I have trouble with my brain comprehending with some of the relativity and time dilation things. It's one of those things that I've never really
sure.
it's it's just one of those things I've never really wrapped my brain around very
Well,
effectively.
basically, all you need to really understand is that when they go into go fast, like into deep
Oh yeah, no,
space,
I understand the
well,
concept,
just
but I
explain to the
just
audience as well.
yeah.
It's like the sense that going fast makes time go slow for you. So as they're zooming out into space to do something, it's like, oh, let's look at the clock. Oh, it's been 2 seconds, but 5 months has already passed on back on Earth. Essentially, that type of thing. The exact way they handle it isn't necessarily perfect science, but for what they're going for, which is more just the sort of like the importance and like the impact of in order for us to actually fight for humanity's survival, everything is I'm leaving all my previous friends and past lives behind and everybody I know, like that sort of thing. They're kind of going for that direction,
It was
and
more
they
dramatically important,
sure,
than it was necessarily about being scientifically accurate. I feel
sure,
like it was. It helped them explain why the characters to certain sets of characters don't age, whereas advancements in technology and weaponry was being able to advance during that time period.
yeah, because like technology starts actually somewhat rustic at the beginning, but then as time goes on, like the technology keeps ramping on, like from episode to episode as they like kind of come back to Earth. Like, oh, everybody's got like sort of like PDA type things now or whatever. Like, I don't know when it happens, but at one point, like they basically used to see in the background, it's like, oh, I think there's like sentient dolphins working on the ship now. Like, when
Yeah,
did
and
that
that
happen? Like,
they I only saw them in the final episode, I think,
yeah,
because that's when they had the weird ship that does the Futurama thing where it bends the space around it rather than going through space.
well, they introduced that in us a few things. Like there's like early on like about warp and stuff where they have the two different types of like fast speed. Like you can go really fast, so, like near light speed to just go straight, but then you can also kind of teleport thing.
Yeah, that was one of the things I found kind of confusing.
Well, it's just the fact that teleporting you can move, considerably faster. Just you don't have to go at light speed as much essentially. Whereas with light speed, your space is big, so even
Well,
going at the
yes.
speed of light, things are very slow. So it's more like, oh, things work in like at very high speeds. It's not literally light speed, but basically as close as you can get. And then everything else, like they usually are using like warp, and that's a big thing for like some like the space travel stuff where they're kind of teleporting around at times. though it's not super relevant. Like the physics doesn't actually matter that much, other than the sense of hey, the emotional impact that they're going for.
Well,
But
I was just wondering that, okay, so they can warp, then
mhm.
why do they spend so much time in light speed otherwise? Because they could easily just not have that time
Well,
dilation problem if,
it's
they're
implied
just
that they
using,
can't warp much. It's like it's kind of like they
right.
can do like
It's
jumps.
like a
Remember
big
that they have the
energy
thing in the
thing.
last episode where they're like, we have perfect time. Like they'll take forever for the aliens to get here because they can't warp at this distance,
Right.
and then they
Okay, that
warp
makes
right in
sense.
front of them, and they're like, crap.
Right. Because basically everything that happens in this anime, at least in terms of combat or strategy, is on the galaxy scale.
Mhm.
So it's we're on the tail outer edge of the galaxy, and whatever problem's happening is in the center of the galaxy.
Yeah, their physics there is not. I mean, for the time, I guess it was okay. Like they kind of like, there's just a bunch of stars in the center of the galaxy, and that ends up being sort of well, true, not also quite right, but hey, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So basically, the whole thing is that they're part of like a recruitment program to find some pilots to pilot these tiny they're piloting like tiny little robots, but the actual thing is that the coach is preparing them for piloting the titular Gunbuster, which is supposed to be this awesome mega robot that will somehow be able to help them against the aliens. And
And that one doesn't even show up until the fourth episode, or is
I
it
believe
fifth? Like
so.
it doesn't show up till pretty late, which is like, here's the thing with usually these kinds of these mecha shows is that it kind of ends the same way, like kind of in a Power Ranger sense.
Hmm.
Like usually these shows treat them like a Zord.
Hmm.
Like they go, oh, this thing happens. Now we have to summon this and do the special move, and that solves the problem for this episode. Like
Yeah.
this one really doesn't do that. I think in general this is a bit structured a little bit more like a movie, but
Hmm.
not quite. It's still somewhat episodic, but it feels much more of a film style in terms of how they kind of do the overall plot.
I mean, it definitely fits the OVA format, like the direct-to-video format, because that's kind of the thing you aim for with that. Though even
Yeah.
with that, like the very
It's still
fact of not,
episodic.
yeah,
It's just that overall the progression is what I mean. Like,
yep,
they don't introduce Gunbuster right away. Like,
sure, which is kind of crazy, like you said, it's kind of crazy for like mecha type series because it used to be considered pretty like like verboten for you to ever do that. There was
yeah.
an example for there being a more realistic mecha series called Victory Gundam,
Hmm.
where by one of my favorite directors of all time, Yoshiyuki Tomino, where basically he had the titular robot, the Gundam, show up in like the fifth episode, and the studio was like, "No, we're going to air the episodes out of order just to show it there in the first episode that we air," and it made no sense at all, and it completely screwed up everything
Yeah, I guess
because
it's
they
because
because they aired like the
they
first
have to
like
market the thing. So,
yeah, because it's a lot of this type of thing. It's more to sell like action figures or models or whatever, than it is to actually, tell a plot. Though with Gunbuster,
you
not
have the
really.
female characters kind of that could, I mean, from a cynical marketing standpoint, I could say that maybe
I
like they could get away with that a little bit with the outfits they give most of the female
I
characters.
mean, I think this kind of predates that sort of thing to some degree.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it's fan servicey.
Oh
It
yeah.
is a Gainax title. It's though to be fair, is it weird that I kind of find it almost quaint by modern standards? Like you
Yeah,
occasionally see like a girl come out like step out of like a bath and you just see like a boob and it's like
yeah, like they're
it's
not
like it's not even
commenting
like
going
that
like,
like
"Wow, your breasts are so big. I'm so jealous about how mine are small," and doing the weird posing and everything. Like they're very naturalistic.
yeah, it feels like
Like
kind of
they're
like
just they're taking baths or in the gym shower. That's kind of it. Like in comparison, that's relatively tame. Like
yeah, it feels like kind of like how film you can have a boob in it and it's not like porn. It's like it's not even like soft core. It's just it's like oh you guys felt like you had to do this I guess, huh?
yeah,
All
like
right,
it didn't really, I didn't really even pay attention to it that much. Like again,
sure,
the characters, again, unlike more modern stuff, they don't call attention to it.
yeah. So I mean, with basically the plot of the first episode is that Noriko is very bad at piloting the robot. Essentially, she tries real hard, but she's not very good at piloting like the tiny little training robots that they have, and
She can't keep track of all the data. The one kind of thing I like about this one is that they kind of they think about, that's the thing with Anno's work in general, is that he's kind of obsessed with logistics, and that's kind of something interesting about him, like all the way the mechanics work and all the stuff. Like they, I mean, he's not actually researching how these things work, but he makes things look very complex and very much put together. And like the way these robots are controlled is treated as complex as you think piloting a giant humanoid robot would be like.
Mhm.
So
That's kind of
yeah,
a big thing with like a lot of his work where they show like the mechanical parts like really moving. Like they may not make a lot of sense, but they show like even like the
it's
cockpit
a
stuff.
thought out process.
Sure.
Yeah,
It,
like, and that's something that I think is very common. I mean, you see that in Ava all the time,
sure,
and
absolutely.
that's what makes it kind of cool. It's like an interesting directorial style, and it brings you into that world. Like,
Hmm.
it's not about it making sense, but it's to think that okay, this was a thought out world.
Hmm.
Maybe sometimes a bit too much. As I remember, I don't remember which episode this was in, but there's this beginning scroll that just explains all this really dumb pseudoscience backstory. It just scrolls just for like the first 5 minutes of this episode for
It
no
seems almost like a
reason.
joke when they do it to some degree. Like,
Well, yeah, because in the background they have them just the characters talking as if they're at a party, but it's otherwise though it's a black screen with white text.
yeah, it's a weird sequence. Basically, Noriko is really bad compared to her One-sama, and then the whole thing that she ultimately gets selected because the coach sees something in her. He knows. So the coach got saved by her father essentially. So she gets selected to be one of the selected pilots for the Gunbuster program, and the other students are kind of pissed about it because she's not actually that good.
Or at least two appearances
Yeah,
at this point.
yeah, and
So,
so in one
and
of
the other characters who have worked really hard,
yes, absolutely. And then one of the other pilots essentially, challenges her to a duel after school, basically like let's fight for it. And it's basically like, oh, nobody told the coach about it, and the coach just shows up and he's like, eh. And then the whole thing about that essentially Noriko like is getting overwhelmed by the data, and she turns off her monitors and stuff, and does an anime-assed robot kick essentially.
the lightning kick,
Yep,
yes.
Inazuma kick, yeah, and
But she does it blind. But I think also there's a big montage because she feels that she needs to actually work hard to even get to
yep.
that point.
Well, yeah, that's kind of that. It's a very this is an interesting work in the sense that it kind of frames itself in the very realistic sort of standpoint of like mecha and stuff and like pilot stuff. There's a little bit of a Top Gear or not a Top Gear, a Top Gun to it to some
Mm.
degrees. Kind of a they kind of couch in like kind of a realistic pilot sense. On the other hand, you then have them, her, essentially get by hard work and guts, and then
Yeah.
eventually she does a super robot thing, or particularly when we get to the talk about the fifth episode is when things kind of like towards the end it's like oh, I see what's happening here, we're doing something completely different now.
Yeah, she doesn't even really get all that competent until something like the fourth or fifth episode.
Well, yeah, well, the whole thing is that she's very struggling with her own sense of inadequacy when it's her own confidence and being
Oh yeah.
hot-blooded and stuff that's actually her asset essentially for apparently what the coach is so
Her kind of straightforwardness, I think, is what they kind of considered it.
yeah.
Yeah. So she does that. She wins that battle, wins over pretty much everybody who at the school at least who
For the
goes.
time being
For
anyways.
well, at the school they acknowledge her.
Yeah.
Then they go off into space, and then there's another set because now you have all the other people up there are the ones who are selected from their given schools. I mean, this is just a provincial school from Okinawa.
Yep.
So, and I guess this is supposed to be an international effort, but it's kind of I don't know. The international politics of this is very confusing.
Well, I think the idea is essentially that you take it's like a United World Government ruled by Japan because I think Japan won World War III or something dumb. Like it's not worth thinking about. It's
Yeah,
goofy,
it's
but
it's
it doesn't
confusing, but
matter.
it's like yeah,
It's like who cares? Like it's such a minor background detail that it's just like everything is slightly Japanese and occasionally, and then you had just have a Russian pilot show up called Jung Freud.
yeah. Let's get into that name.
It's
I
like,
mean, I
well,
guess she must have been from like East Germany because she's from the Soviet Union.
I guess.
I gue- I mean, also young Freud. Oh God.
Yeah. So they go to I believe like is it the moon? going off of memory, or they go to some
I
sort of.
think it is. It is a moon base. No, she's young Freud is from the moon, but they're just at this floating base. I think it's
Sure.
like a satellite of some sort
Yep, and then
where
they
they're
go
doing the
there to
training.
do like some like sort of training missions, essentially.
And young Freud, I guess, has her eye on Amano. I don't know if they've ever met before, but somehow there's this like rivalry that's going on, and so she challenges her in the middle of an exercise to basically fight it out illegally, but fight it out because they're like,
Yep.
"Damn the consequences! I'm gonna show you." And so then, in this huge collateral damage that's supposed to be this like secret backyard fight,
Exactly. It's like it's weird that they move, the sense of like it's just such a petty thing, but then they're also doing it with robots and causing a lot of damage and shit.
like, how do you think one would possibly get away with this type of thing?
The,
I mean, they
the,
don't, but like, they had to at least have thought of the fact that they would get away with it.
I don't know, man. They're kids,
Well,
right?
apparently, young Freud has like some kind. She is a has some kind of standing already. Like she's supposed to be in the military with rank already at this point.
Yeah, I mean, Jung will just outright say she's sort of proto Asuka from Evangelion, sort of like that, sort of
She
like
kind of is, but like less developed in every way.
sure. I mean, it's a shorter work for one, but
Oh
yeah.
yeah, but she's not as interesting, and really she just seems schizophrenic, and it doesn't make sense half the
She,
time.
she's not really schizophrenic. She's just kind of she's Russian, you know.
I guess.
She's Russian.
I don't know what that exactly means, but
I'm winking at my screen right now. She's Russian. But basically, it's kind of like the whole thing that they do a little dumb, a little fight, and then they discover like, oh, that we accidentally bumped into your secret area and found like a space alien in the thing, like
a
yo,
corpse sample that they had collected,
yeah,
and
and it's
it's
like,
this
oh,
giant, ugly thing.
it's
Yeah,
like these space aliens aren't like humanoid at all. These are like sprawling sort of like things. They're not. They don't look like anything really like anything on Earth. Kind of like look like kind of coral like almost. Just like
yeah.
that they just float around in space essentially.
Some of them feel like like plankton or weird kind of shrimp.
Yeah. And I think this is where they do then they have the plot where they end up going and like they're doing like light speed training and stuff like that, and they end up finding her old her father's ship.
Well, they go into subspace,
Yep, subspace.
where apparently Newtonian physics also. Well, I mean, they're already every day because they're pretty much at light speed all the time anyway. Newtonian physics is already kind of falling apart to begin with, and
Right.
then I guess it's even more so in this subspace thing.
Yeah, which is because they basically, again, the science here isn't like great by any means. It's more interesting in how they kind of handle it, like the whole thing of like, oh yeah, space is actually ether, and you're kind of that's how we can go faster than light or whatever. And it's like, yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
So they go to the subspace thing and they find her father's ship. Is and then they have the whole emotional thing of her looking for her father and ship and separating from everybody, and then gasp, the bridge is gone because of course. And then she finally realized that actually she won't ever be able to find her father again. He's dead. Not to mention the fact that, well, kind of the whole thing is like, oh, with relativity, it could have, and being stuck in
It
like
was
a subspace.
2 days had passed on the ship, and there were
Yep,
pockets of area with air and shit. Although she's running around bursting through walls and opening doors to who know what's it, she
yep,
could have probably killed him anyway if he wasn't in the bridge that blew up.
yep. It's just an interesting, like the kind of emotional thing of her basically searching. It's years later, like 5 years later, and then she finds this pocket of like time almost that has you like, oh, my father could realistically be alive here, because like, it's only been like 2 days, and then no, that's
Yeah.
not at all. And it's kind of this is sort of the point that kind of sends Noriko down like kind of the dark path for the kind of the next sort of like episode or two.
Well,
She
she
gets
fucks up this mission because again, like because in even within this subspace thing, time is even faster. So like they end up arriving much later than they were supposed to.
yep.
So like her rash action almost also got them all killed too, because like
All killed and also kind of like could have made it so they would have not been able to help at all with like their mission because they got stuck out there for how goddamn long.
yeah, so that definitely is what I think also hit her pride as well, and made her question her ability.
And certainly made Amano really start like sort of doubting her.
And honestly, I think Amano is kind of like, I know the show treats this as like, how could you have this such lack of confidence? It's like, have you seen how this how things have been going? She's actually quite rational here.
Yeah, especially because in the next episode they have it where they basically they start with the Eltrium, like their big ship essentially goes out like, okay, we're gonna try bringing the fight to the aliens. We're ready this time. Now that they took out our scouting ship, we're ready to see what they're actually up to. And things go horribly wrong every single time from this point on, essentially.
Yeah,
It,
so she breaks up her partnership with Noriko. I mean,
yep.
and she also does it. She actually tells her like, "I'm doing this for your safety,"
Yeah, because you're just gonna get yourself killed. You're
which is
terrible.
which is right,
Which is
and it gets
probably correct. Yes.
no, actually, it is right, pretty much. I mean, she's lucky in this case because so in this episode she meets Smith Torrin, who immediately is not long for this world because he's one of the characters that doesn't show up in the intro at all.
Yep.
That's how you can tell. He's an American pilot of some sort, and he forms a part. He's a bit of a delinquent, I guess, and he forms a partnership instead with Noriko, and so they're teamed up on this thing. And he says, I'll go on offense and you go on defense, and you watch my back.
And then everything, and then they have their first encounter with the aliens, and people just start dying all over the
Over like
place.
the thing is, here's the kind of interesting thing about this show is there's actually not a lot of on-screen death that you can see.
Sure.
Like normally these things you see like the inside of the cockpit and they'll say something like, a meaningful line and then they get blown up
And then they explode,
everything goes
which is
white and the
pointless, yeah.
sound goes out and all that. No, in this one like the way he dies is he just disappears.
Yeah, he just dies off screen.
Yeah, she couldn't see him to begin with, so she's lost. And these two red things go by at the speed of light, and she can't see what's what, and we can't tell what the hell they're doing. And then she just loses communication with them. There's
Yep.
no sound, no explosion, no him screaming. He's just gone.
Which really does not help Noriko's, confidence at all, because now she's really
No.
freaked the
Now
fuck
she
out
got
about
s-
space.
Well, now she got someone killed because she was supposed
Someone
to
she was
be.
having like a crush on and stuff, and then he just died. I mean, to be fair, there was not much she could have done either way, because
Kind of, because she was supposed to have stopped the two things that had flown by her multiple times.
but how could you have stopped them? Like nobody could like they were basically doing nothing to them.
That's true. Yeah, they didn't quite understand how fast these guys were going to go, I guess. But I mean, I'm saying is like it's understandable that she wasn't able to, but in her mind,
Oh
you
yes,
know,
absolutely, and it kind of reinforced the fact that this whole thing is fucked.
yeah,
And basically, Noriko unsurprisingly goes like already. She was basically rejected as a friend, and as a partner by Amano. Everything's going kind of shitty. Her crush just got murdered in front of her essentially, and she didn't even notice essentially.
and
She,
she can view it as her fault for not taking defense, and she makes it back barely alive.
yeah, and in general, it turns out all of humanity is looking pretty hosed here because they aren't doing crap against these aliens. So, needless to say, she comes out of this feeling pretty negative about this whole thing.
Oh
And
yeah,
then I think at this point is roughly when like Noriko basically goes to coach like, okay, she eventually decides like, okay, I need to do something, and then she starts training with coach again, like one on one.
even harder,
Yep,
and that sets off young Freud again.
yeah. And basically, Young wants to become the other Gunbuster pilot with Amano. Not that really they know much about what Gunbuster is, other than this great thing that coach has apparently been working on. And she challenges, Noriko to like a duel sort of in space. And if I remember correctly how this ends, like Noriko basically immediately has like a PTSD thing and breaks
Yeah,
down
she ends up having a panic disorder attack.
and like passes out essentially, and just has to
Oh
be
yeah.
she basically has to be taken in and like wheeled out because she's
Yeah,
freaking
she
the fuck
wakes up
out
in
so
the
bad.
hospital where Amano and Freud have a big argument and slap each other.
Yeah. And then, I think it's roughly at the point when the captain realizes just how lost they are at this point. Like, there's nothing
Yeah,
that they
to,
can
to
actually
cut their
do.
losses and return home, and hopefully some breakthrough would happen by then.
So they basically return, and they just basically, all the sub fleet that they have with them just starts getting attacked in subspace, and they're just
Yeah,
getting their asses kicked. And then they finally, I think they actually end up like at the edge of the solar system. Like, okay, we can't actually continue any further because we're just going to lead everybody's like lead the aliens straight to Earth at this point.
Yeah, like they're worried that if they don't defeat them within the subspace thing, or if they defeat them elsewhere, because here's the thing: is they discovered that these alien beings use stars kind of like as incubation chambers,
Yeah.
because they went to a place that used to be a leaf 40 something, and it was a white, well, a white slash yellow star, much like ours, but then they arrived there and it's suddenly a huge red gas giant, and they're like, holy shit, what the fuck? And they realize that it's the aliens using it, because you can and we also see them, you know, their larger versions birthing out of it, so they're
And the
worried that.
large aliens are massive. They're like giant, like sort of like arrowhead type things. They're
Yeah, they
like
look like the ships from Star Wars, like the battle
these
cruiser
star
things.
destroyers, yeah. But
Yeah.
they're like star. There's a very sort of like starfishy aspect to them, like in terms of like how they look. How do you feel about the actual look and sort of like presentation of the aliens?
I kind of find them really interesting.
Yeah.
They're grotesque, but in a kind of fascinating way. Like they do they have that oceanic crustacean ish feeling to
Hmm.
them. Um,
A kind of
it's
derms more, I'd say, but
yeah, yeah, kind of like a like as you're saying, like a starfish or a sea urchin thing, but they have other kind of features going on as well that aren't quite that
yeah.
either.
Yeah, I mean, the material of them looks just they look really alien, but they also look like realistic to some degree, just because they did a really good mixture of using like like anatomical things clearly of like echinoderms and like sort of like undersea like deep sea type things and using parts of them, and
Yeah.
they're not very consistent in form like deliberately, but there's like similarities between them that makes it look like it's like just kind of this weird alien thing that just really just impossible. Like there's no technology at all like with what they do. It all seems to be biological, and there's like there also does not appear to be any actual intelligence to them. Like they're intelligent, but it's an alien intelligence. So they capture that sort of feel really well. That
Like
this is
kind of like what you would say like ant or bee intelligence, like from a hive sense.
yeah.
It feels like that.
Yeah. And essentially they get attacked by one of the larger versions of these, aliens, and they are getting the shit kicked out of them essentially.
Like most of their fleet is all getting destroyed.
As well as like many like everybody goes out and like these smaller tiny little robots to do something, and essentially Noriko decides to finally like okay we need to do this, the gunbuster isn't complete at this point. I'm just going to go out there on my own and do
She pretty
something.
much just hijacks it for her own at this point.
And this is really kind of reinforces like what I really like about Gunbuster, and it's really cool ass sequences, like when the Gunbuster is emerging from the ship, and like the entire scene is
Yeah.
really rad.
Well,
It's a
again,
real
that's the director's specialty, I think. Is he's
yeah.
just really good at that type of stuff.
It's just really like yeah. There's a lot of good scenes like this also in like Evangelion, just like really just rad sequences of the robots emerging from the top of the ship as like like drums are playing, and like eventually breaks out like this kind of like big orchestra type like thing of like this is the thing that we've been waiting for like over like 4 episodes now. It's the Gunbuster. Here it is.
Finally.
And even it basically can't do much.
Well,
And
she's piloting it by herself as opposed to having
and also
uh
it's like it's like incomplete at this point. And ultimately she manages to defeat the large alien by essentially letting it impale her
yeah.
at like light speed. She manages to use like the inertial canceling thing to somehow survive it, and then like electrify it to
Uh
death.
yeah, she breaks through a little bit of like the outer shell and then electrifies the inside, and it just blows up in a
Yeah,
cloud of like gaseous like I don't know, innards or something like that.
yeah, and they basically they like, oh, we won, and it's like, well, that was one alien of, as it turns out, seems like millions, in fact, billions.
From the center of the fucking galaxy.
Yeah, and they basically like, oh, we're hosed. They basically just kind of returned to Earth because the ship got the shit beat out of it. Like every thousands of pilots died. Things are going bad. And then they return to Earth and turns out like, oh, due to time dilation, 10 years have passed at this point. Like everybody's like, oh, her childhood friend now is like an adult with like a
With a
kid.
kid.
Like the rival that was fighting him is now the current coach for the school.
Yep.
And it's like kind of like, oh, it's like they really go into this sort of like there's a peaceful lull sort of going on, but like it's at the same time like the fact that time's passed them by really just starts getting kind of like a depressing type thing of
It's a
what's going on here.
psychological thing too, and a social thing, which I thought
Yep,
was kind of a nice thing. And I think also around this time, I think even in the episode before, it felt a lot more Ava-like because there were a lot more moments where he let them kind of breathe. You know,
sure.
for dramatic moments, like characters wouldn't always answer each other right away. You could see the character kind of cogitating a little bit before they would say something, which
Eh,
I thought was kind of something that he did really well, and what really separated when Ava first came out. I think that was a feature that hadn't really been done in a lot of anime like that.
Sure, and this is also, I mean, starting with like the previous episode, or actually roughly essentially when Smith dies, it's probably about the point where it actually abandons all pretense of it being like a parody of Aim for the Ace, and it starts going
Oh yeah, no,
very
the
much more
tone
in
was
like,
dead by then.
and then very much goes in the Anno direction. Like it's kind of interesting that they kind of use like the shojo sort of like kind of like, oh, sports, we'll do anything with our courage and stuff, and then things go completely to shit with occasional spikes of like, oh, we're standing, risking it all to try to save the Earth type stuff.
Well, like there's victories. It's just that they're in the
They're very
context
Pyrrhic.
of yeah, they're it's victory within the context of like relative hopelessness
Yeah,
of the
it's like we
situation.
won, but at what cost? And also,
Or like how much does this actually accomplish?
yeah,
Yeah.
and this
Like
is
that last victory, where she gets herself impaled and she
yeah,
gets out of there, but like, yay, we did it. We're still fucked though. We're doomed.
yeah. Though they, I don't know how cognizant they are roughly at this point of that. Like just like how many aliens, or like the fact that they thought that they stopped the aliens from discovering Earth essentially at that point. Like, oh, at least we will retreat back here. Maybe things will be fine. We're prepared just in case. And this is roughly the point where we also like discover that Amano has been crushing on the coach real bad. I mean, it
Yeah.
was implied at this point, but yeah, she's got a thing for the coach because everybody's got a thing for Norio Wakamoto.
And for good reason.
I mean, the man has an amazing voice.
Yeah.
He used to be a SWAT policeman.
Really?
Yes.
Wow. That's impressive.
A captain, in fact. But essentially, then it's like, and the coach is like, no, go away. Ah! And
Even
it's,
he even hits her because,
yeah, because 80s anime, sports.
yeah.
And, she goes away and pisses, and it's like, oh, Noriko, come here. I've got space cancer.
Well, not space cancer, it's space radiation poisoning.
Yeah, space radiation poisoning. And it's like, I'm dying. I'm dying real bad. Don't let Amano know because she's crushing on me and it'll like ruin her as like a great ass pilot. But Noriko, you gotta save Earth. You gotta pilot the robot. You gotta do this for me.
Yep. And of course, Amano is not stupid. And
She
she
already
knows.
knows. It's like
Yeah,
kind of
because like
obvious.
they're sent back. They're going to be sent back out into space because they're the only ones that are supposed to pilot Gunbuster, I guess. And Noriko doesn't realize. Oh wait, time dilation. Coach is still back home. Oh yeah, we might come back and he'll probably be dead,
Yeah.
even if we survive.
Yeah, and that's basically they discover like this massive fleet of like hundreds of thousands of aliens coming to like towards Earth. And it's like, oh, we're hoes. It's kind of like we like what do we actually do? And then the coach bursts in basically in the crutches like I've got a great idea. Let's blow up our ship and make a black hole and just destroy them all. It'll
Like
totally work.
the decommissioned ship, essentially.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the ship from that they were all using previously. It's like that's the only thing we can do. Guys, got any better ideas? And so they send out Noriko and Amano like in the Gunbuster split apart to try to guard the ship to get it to a certain point where they could blow it up and generate a black hole like to consume the aliens. And Amano finally breaks down in the middle of this like saying like, oh, I can't, I have to go back. I can't deal with the fact that like Coach is gonna die when we're fighting out here because like they look at like the date thing that they have in there, which what they probably shouldn't have put that in there. It seems like that would be really stressful to watch.
Yeah.
They're watching like, oh, like months has literally passed in this last like minute or so. Oh,
Yeah, and gee, it's almost as if one of us is super conscious about how time is passing because she fucking told me.
it's starting having a panic attack. It's like, and then this is really like when Noriko really has like kind of the breakthrough like as a character, kind of like what she is. Like it's like
Well,
look,
she also sees Amano expressing that weakness for the first time.
sure. And then this is finally where Noriko really herself comes across as like why she's the confident one. Like, look, if we do nothing, everybody is going to die, It's like the only way
Not
there could
just
be.
him.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like any piece. Like my friend will die, her daughter will die. We needed to do this now. Yes, shit is going bad for us, but we need to fight. You know,
Well, because at the same time, the Earth is considering an evacuation plan.
sure.
So there's that going on in the background as well.
Yeah, and like there's literally they're being attacked at this point like by like hundreds of thousands of those large ass aliens from prior before where they barely beat one. And it's like
Yeah.
we need to do this thing with the bomb, and also the ship at this point is getting the shit torn out of it like by tiny ones. So
Yeah. And so like they have to get that shit done now. So through a variety of special moves that we had never heard of before.
hold on, we have the awesome combination sequence and musical number.
Right.
It's
I think that's
fucking
the only time
rad.
well, it's nice because it's not a repeat one because you only get to see that happen once.
Yes, and it's
So
rad as shit. Like this is honestly one of my favorite sequences, like just like period in anime. Not because it's necessarily like the most like amazingly well done one. It's just
it's still well
rad.
done. I mean,
It is well
overall
done. It's like really well
overall the
animated stuff.
animation in this whole OVA is good quality.
And this
I
is
mean,
though
like,
this sequence and the next episode is really kind of where the budget just kind of goes. Like
oh yeah,
okay,
budget destroyers.
it's like you can just imagine them like kind of like turning the budget knob slowly to the right, and then just like slip the arm slip and just turns it all the way to 110%.
Yes.
And basically, this is when the thing goes like full on. It's like, oh, we were acting like this is like realistic thing with like the robot shit. Nah, this shit is over the top as shit. Like this is where
It's almost like they aimed for it and then surpassed this top.
yes, they aim for the top with their Gunbuster, and then they basically the robot Gunbuster combines and just starts blowing holes through like millions of aliens at once, and it is rad.
Oh yeah, lots of orange dots in the horizon to indicate mass extinctions.
Yes, those aliens suck. But the whole one thing I would pause here is that the version we were watching, I was a little annoyed by because this is actually turns out has redone audio from the version I saw years ago. And while the script is exactly the same, some of the I don't care for some of the execution necessarily. The original version of this had a lot of Star Wars sound effects stolen, and it was rad. like the shot of like the Buster beam where they shoot the laser out of it has like a kind of like a Star Wars like boom as it's blowing through like aliens, and that was rad, and they got rid of that.
What do you do?
Like no, like not like that, but it was just like a really like
I know.
they took like some of the THX sort of sound library, like they were like using some stuff like that, and when they redid the audio, they didn't have the exact sound effects anymore. I don't know if it was actually stolen from Star Wars, but it sounded like it. They didn't have necessarily some of the same sound effects to kind of reuse when they redid the audio for like the Blu-ray release. And they also had like much older, like the characters were played by much older actors of themselves, same actors, but they aged. I think
as people do.
sure, it's been 20 years plus at that point, and like I think the executions for most of the stuff was fine, but the actual shouting of like the moves over the top, like it wasn't as
Oh
good
yeah,
as it
no,
used to be.
they didn't sound exactly as enthusiastic.
Yes, when the original ones sounded really raw, like
Yeah.
oh, this is like a 20-year-old actor screaming at the top of her lungs about homing lasers and stuff. Like it
Yep.
feels really raw and goofy, and I like that a lot.
Like they didn't care about throwing their voice out for that.
After a point, no. Towards like with these much more established actors, no. At that point,
Yeah, yeah.
but then basically they bring out like all the things and like it's like super confident and like the Gunbuster is wrecking shit. Great sequence, not super plot relevant everything in it, but great sequence, really well animated. And then basically finally the Eltrium blows up and they make the black hole to stop the aliens. It's like we managed to do it, yay!
And but they had passed well past 6 months.
Yeah, and they basically they head back to Earth at that point, and Coach is still alive. They did it. They got back in time. They land the Gunbuster outside the hospital, which is a really neat shot.
That one felt very Ava like to me.
Yes, where they actually exit out of like a little door and like the hand and stuff.
Yes.
It's like where did that come
Random
from?
place to have the door in the side of the hand around.
It's
where,
just
like, the
entirely
pinky
so they could
finger
do the
is.
shot of them getting out on the roof of a hospital.
Yeah.
And then we get to the next episode. And the next episode is really different. which is
Yeah,
the
I mean,
final episode, in fact.
in a lot of ways. So
Yeah.
like not it's like what 15 years later.
Yes.
So there's that.
And it's in black and
And
white,
it's all in black and white. And
grayscale.
not and here's the thing is this was not something that was made in color and then turned into black and
No.
white. I think everything in this was actually painted and drawn and all that stuff in black and white.
So, okay, so one thing I've heard this in the past. I've also heard the contradictory. So I want to get your opinion. Do you think this was a cost-saving measure, or do you think it was entirely for the visual effect?
I think it was visual effect for some reason. I mean, it actually looks really
It
interesting
looks
being in
great.
black and white. I don't know why. I can't think of a thematic reason why everything
I
is in
can.
black and white, other than this is like kind of a projected future of some sort.
I think I know. I think it's sort of going for kind of a nostalgia sense of like it invokes sort of like the 60s and 70s sort of like, before color space opera type stuff to some degree.
But to what effect? I mean, that's what I'm having trouble is
Sure.
thematically to to what end? Like, yes, it's black and white is always going to invoke a certain form of nostalgia. I mean, unless you're doing like unless you want specifically the sharpness and high contrast that black and white filming
I mean,
gives over color. But
you didn't really have that there. I mean, it gives sort of like a feel though, like kind of a sort of nostalgic and also kind of a like a feel like, oh, this is it. Like I don't know how necessarily how to articulate that. It gives like a sense of
finality of some sort.
sure, like either to like the human race or like to like the struggle, like oh, this is the struggle to end all struggles, like oh, like we need to do this now type stuff, and it also gives a sense of like sort of like with a time skip, it gives kind of a sense of like how much time passed, like not necessarily because the color passing changed, but kind of like the jump from the previous episode
It
to this
feels
one.
that sense of difference in that it's an alien feeling.
Yeah,
Like everything feels different.
right.
And in this case, plot wise, Noriko has been back out in space for something like 6 months, whereas the 15 years have passed on Earth with Amano having married Coach Ota, who has now passed away.
Yep.
And so Amano is heading back to
And Amano's in fact
space.
is like it's like teaching at like the school. She's the coach now.
She's the new coach,
And
but
like the rival now is like an elderly lady and like
she's like the principal of the school.
yeah, and then like her like Noriko's childhood friend who had the kid. The kid's now a student graduating from the school, not quite yet, but nearly there.
Yeah.
And so the whole thing
So
is that they're basically saying like, okay, the aliens are gonna marshal again. They seem to be bred from stars, or they seem to raise themselves in stars.
yeah, and there's
We're
also
gonna
been a huge amount of damage on Earth already.
yeah from like them coming at Earth and them barely being fought out. It's like oh we have a great idea. Let's
Take that
turn
bomb idea.
Jupiter into a black hole and blow up the center of the galaxy.
Yeah.
Great, fucking great. Whatever. It's
Well,
dumb,
they
like it's
also talk
bad
about how
science.
there was something called there was another planet called Jupiter 2
I think
that
Jupiter 2 is intended to be like a like sort of planet X, like past Pluto, which
yeah,
we
no
have
it is,
discovered
but
stuff since then.
they mentioned something about it, but I don't I again there's a whole bunch of these little details that are thrown in that I didn't quite understand. Like yeah, Jupiter 2 is this planet that is outside of our, normal solar system like at the edge of it, but they didn't really explain. I don't know.
It's just
It's a
I
whole
mean
mess.
well the thing is of good sci-fi, like good sci-fi, this is like a thing that they say is like you don't explain everything. That's not the point. The point is
Well,
to
no, I know I wasn't asking for it to be explained, but it was brought up to what end?
no, that's what it's considered good sci-fi. Like that is like you invoke something and you just kind of touch on it, but kind of move past it. Like it gives like that's what establishes a feel of a setting without going too much in detail. Not everything has to serve the purpose of actually moving the plot along. A lot of it's setting up the feel of the setting in terms of
Gotcha. Okay.
like there's a comment like William Gibson made, the guy who wrote like Neuromancer and whatnot, was commenting on the movie Escape from New York.
Hmm.
And one of the examples of like good like sci-fi writing in that thing is that there's a line, like a throwaway line about it's like you flew the gull wing over Moscow, didn't you? And it's like the line has almost no real purpose in terms of like oh other than establishing that Snake Plissken was like an undercover operative. Like the actual details of it, of like what that actually means,
Hmm.
is utterly pointless. But it gives you a feeling and makes you think like what what does that mean? Like it makes you think and
I get
consider.
it. So it adds texture to the reality that they're
Sure,
working with.
absolutely. It's kind of like
Okay.
having like, you could have throwaway sort of comments on, like, oh, here's setting details about this, world. But even though it doesn't actually serve the plot itself, a lot of science fiction, and true for fantasy to some degree, but particularly science fiction is about getting you to feel like this is a real thing. It's kind of convincing you that the illusion is, you could suspending your disbelief and then taking a level beyond to say, okay, not only am I suspending my disbelief, I'm believing this world and entering and placing my mind within the context of it.
Yeah.
It's to the point where you can see background dolphins working on the spaceship, and
Yes,
it's
with
kind of
weird
this, you
little
just
helmets
and
on.
these little helmets on, and there's little jet packs on them, and you keep moving past it. It's kind of like,
Yeah.
okay, that doesn't matter. Kind of a random thing to happen there. I can accept that there's
It
sentient dolphins
works.
working on this ship.
Yep.
Whatever. No, it's an
Yeah.
interesting kind of. A lot of the setting stuff about Gunbuster is really dumb. Like the world, like Japan ruling the world, essentially shit. Like who cares? They don't even touch on it. But the actual sort of textural elements that they actually have around the stuff that gives kind of the feeling to the setting of like how all the admirals are sort of like in sort of Japanese sort of admiral outfits and whatnot.
Well,
You
they
know,
look like they're wearing Hugo Boss.
yeah, sure. And like a lot of weird ass stuff of like like the when they're talking about when they're bringing the Buster machine number 3, which is the black hole thing.
It
It's like
looks like a giant
egg,
black pill of
yeah,
some sort.
or egg. And
Yeah.
during that sequence has like the captain of like the ship who's been around for a while now eating like a watermelon essentially.
Yeah.
That feels like a very Japanese ass thing.
Well, they're also eating sushi in other scenes too.
Sure. I mean, it's just kind of like a sort of like very Japanese sort of feel, like completely pointless to the actual plot. Like it's not like they're going for something necessarily there about like a thematic stuff. It just like it gives a feel to the setting that's unique and different.
Yeah. And
So
again, it adds a specificity to it.
sure. And so basically the whole thing is that like, like oh, they make this bomb and then like even the fact of removing Jupiter is like fucking up the Earth real bad. Because
Well,
like
yeah.
the differences like the orbits is causing issues on Earth, and it's like oh who knows if we'll even be able to Okinawa will even exist in like a week or so, or or a few months as they'll tides start changing and whatnot. And they make Jupiter into a bomb and like okay we're gonna pilot this out there. We'll send Amano out there to meet up with the new capital ship, and meet up with Noriko and see how that's going. And she goes out there and like Noriko and her reconnect, but at the same time, like Noriko and Jung have been out there for like 4 months, and Amano is like an adult ass lady at this point. Noriko is like what, like 18?
It was a 15-year difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like Noriko's like, oh, I remember talking to you like a month ago. And it's like and Amano's like how nostalgic type thing. It's like oh that's kind of fucked, from they go for that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And they also have her pass on like the letter from her childhood friend's daughter, essentially, and like her childhood friend saying like, "Hey, I'm probably gonna be dead by the time you get back. Say hi to my daughter for me." Like, or try to get back to say hi
If
to my
that.
daughter, which really does. It's kind of a mean ass thing to send her, you know?
Yeah, but it's at the same time kind of like
It
yeah,
gives her
it's weird.
context.
It gives her context, but at the same time, it's like, oh right, I've only been here 6 months, and she's an old woman now.
Yeah,
Like
it's
everyone I know. Like, well, here's the other thing. So her dad's dead. Does she just not have a mom?
I probably I think so. I mean, Coach Oda's been basically been her dad for a little bit there.
I guess. I mean, they don't. They,
It's
I
weird that
guess.
it is for what they're going for. I understand why they don't really go into it because the focus is so much on the father figure and like the importance of it to her. But it is weird, yes, that like
Well, like they do the best friend in the role that could have been done by the mom as well. Meaning, like by the time I get back, she's gonna be dead.
yeah. Well, her mother would have been already dead at this point. Yeah, it's weird. They don't touch on that at all. I don't think they even mention her having a mother.
No, we never see her. We see the dad a couple times, but nope, never the mother.
That is interesting.
Yeah, I guess she's just a Disney mom.
Yep. And then they basically is like, okay, we're gonna pilot out of there, and then they basically work out the numbers. Like, well, it's gonna take us like 15 minutes to get this bomb ready, and it's gonna take 38 minutes for the aliens to get here because they can't warp this close. Like, well, they have that interesting conversation between the captain and the vice captain about God there.
Oh yeah, whether or not a miracle will happen or whether or
Or,
not
or it's
humanity
like,
ha
do you believe in God? And the vice captain's like, nah.
Yeah.
The captain's like the captain's like, I do, because it's like this is perfect. Like the aliens can't do shit. We're gonna win here. Victory for us.
They feel like they're being guided by Providence.
Yeah, it's like if there's anything that the word miracle was ever invented for, it's this moment right now where we're saving humanity from death by essentially killing the galaxy. Is how they put it.
Yeah. No, they also go like, are we actually are we the baddies?
Well, it's kind of
Are
the
we
sense like, is
actually the
this
bad
right for us
people?
to do this? And they call attention to the fact that like basically the aliens are essentially they articulate as kind of like the galaxy's white blood cells. Like humans are inherently
The immune system to the
yeah,
galaxy.
like
We're the bacteria that's just infesting.
yeah, we're just like in like a alien thing that's actually going to just ruin the galaxy. Whereas these aliens, maybe these aliens are like a natural force they put there, and perhaps by a god or something, to stop humans, which are inherently destructive to the environment, whatnot, from causing damage. And maybe that's why the aliens are trying to kill us.
Yeah.
Like, and you could say like, well, the aliens are eating stars, so they're probably not much better, to be honest.
Yeah, well, either way. Like, well, I guess to them we're just a nuisance to them.
Sure. I mean, it is weird that the aliens are deliberately going out of their way to attack humanity when we're not. Until the aliens really started targeting us, like Earth isn't a big deal. There's like the ship. The only reason why they start developing this stuff is because the aliens are fighting them.
Yeah.
So they basically it's like, oh, we've got plenty of time to blow up this giant bomb, and then the aliens teleport on top of them. They
Yeah.
get into this like, you think they're going to get into another action sequence like the previous episode, but they don't.
No, because yeah, well, they kind of do because like there is a battle and they they fend them off to some degree, but then there's been a bunch of damage done to
Well, the
the
battle.
ship.
Let's talk about this battle sequence because it's a very interesting sort of way it's presented. Instead of it being like a drawn out sort of action sequence, it's more like still shots over like sort of like almost like over
They look like
classical music.
storyboards that were then just filmed and shook and
Honestly, I
moved.
think it works better than if they actually had filmed it out, though.
Oh yeah, because they didn't need to show it all. I mean,
E-
basically, what was happening in terms of action, it was just like a tower defense game. So this was much more interesting than what they would have done
Well,
otherwise.
yeah, it's them trying to defend this bomb essentially, and while they're like throwing them, like everybody's throwing their lives away at this. But they have like this thing of like just still shots of like everybody getting blown up and stuff, like and of them like fighting the
It's
aliens.
and it's often in pencil, so it's like very kind of graphic and rough and things like that. I mean,
It it, inv-
I think it sells the idea that not only is this battle intense, it's also very long.
Also it kind of sells the fact that this is like it makes it feel epic. Like it feels like a storybook type of thing. Like here's like something you'd have in like a book of like like the different shots of like a war. Like if you had filming like a war here, like here is the war to end all wars type thing. Like and then just kind of like showing it actually scene by scene
Well,
would
again,
actually
it's
diminish
a
it.
form of narratively compressing the time without necessarily taking out the impact of
Sure.
the event.
And
So,
I think
like,
actually showing it would actually diminish it to some degree.
yeah,
But
because
by
this lets your brain fill in a lot more.
absolutely. And they basically kind of after like I forget how like the 15 minutes of which shown in like 2 minutes essentially. It's like every like the ships are somehow barely there, just covered in like blown up aliens, and they manage to fight off the aliens long enough, and it's like oh like the Gunbuster's intact, but not much else, and also the black hole bomb has been like wrecked to some degree. Like
To some extent, it needs just a little bit more energy to be able to actually go off.
right,
So, like, they have a certain amount of time before the next wave, which will wipe everybody out, arrives.
yep,
But they don't have the bomb. So this is when Noriko and Amano decide, okay, we're going to use the engine inside our own to do it.
yeah. So they pilot the Gunbuster like down through all this crushing gravity, basically just
Because
telling
like
everybody,
yeah, because like Jupiter got compressed, so
yep.
it's like a more solid form of Jupiter.
Yeah, and they're basically knowing the fact that they're gonna basically cause this black hole to go off, and they're basically also going in this knowing that either they're gonna die here, or there's like there's basically no
They're
way
not
that
going to be able to warp with everyone else, so it's going to take a long time for them to get back.
it's gonna take them like they basically like oh whatever we probably not get back on Earth. It's like they do the thing like telling everybody like like sort of like farewell and like Jung is there like all sad about the fact that Amano traded places with her to go down there and like it had like Jung turn back, and they blow up the black hole. And they show like basically it exploding as the Gunbuster tries to get away and finally gets consumed by it essentially. And then the other ships warp away, and then the galaxy slowly over time just kind of gets consumed by this black hole, and that's it. They won, right?
Kind of, yeah.
And then
And then
then we jump to 15,000 years
no,
later.
12. It was 12,000, I think.
12,000 years later, and you basically show the Gunbuster like torn apart. Finally, has like arrived at Earth, and there's like nothing there.
Well, it looks like Earth, but in the dark side, you don't see the lights.
Yeah, and it's like, well, the fact that it's not lit up, it's like, oh, humanity must have died.
Yeah.
Oh, and
But no,
then finally on the Earth, it slowly lights up like a welcome home appears in Japanese.
yeah. So like all the cities had, I guess that side of the world decided, hey, it'd be really great. Let's welcome them back by turning off all the electricity on Earth for for just this one thing, and then turn on selective cities
I mean,
to
they are the
spell out.
saviors of like humanity. Like, they're messianic figures probably at this point. It's like 12,000 years later.
Oh, sure,
One interesting detail, as I understand, is that they actually spelt it slightly wrong.
kind of. I
Like,
don't remember. I mean, it was done in pieces, so I don't remember
I
it.
think like the final character is actually slightly off, like him implying that like Japanese might
The
have
language
changed,
probably, well, yeah,
or it's not
probably,
even there anymore, essentially. So they had to look it up or whatever.
or something. Yeah,
It's like kind of an interesting detail. And it's basically like, oh, then finally they return to Earth, and that's kind of just how the film or the OVA ends.
yeah. Well, I mean, like, it's weird. Like it's like they kind of died because everybody that they knew is gone.
Yeah.
Like absolutely everybody. Like you won't even be able to trace like the family origins any at this
No.
point. Like having them survive narratively just felt kind of weird.
No, I think that's interesting though because it gives kind of there's a tragic sort of thing on it, but at the same time, like the takeaway is, oh, but humanity lived, and also even though everybody is dead, they all got to live like full lives because of what they did, essentially. Like,
Well, that's true. I mean, they could show that the well, what I mean
well,
is
no,
like
I
they
don't.
would.
I think not showing it is more effective though.
Yeah, I guess.
I mean,
I guess that makes sense.
which showing like, oh, Jung lived a happy life, picked up like a young, Swedish gentleman as her husband, trophy husband, and got into, selling shoes. Would
No,
that
I don't
would
think
that
they
have
need to show
like
that. No, I don't
really?
think they need to show that. But I guess like, having died in the sake of this, it implied that this. I don't know. It's weird. I guess I see what they mean.
I mean,
Like it just like for those two characters, I don't see.
well, I mean that was kind of the thing of like the end of episode five, or yeah, five, where they kind of like the whole message like, look, it doesn't matter, like we're kind of sacrificing ourselves anyways by kind of disconnecting our, our time space or time stream from everybody else's by just kind of, our time is different from everybody else's. But in order for other people to live normal ass lives and eat one, not have to do what we're doing ever, and two, not get killed by aliens, like this is what we have to do.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it makes sense that it's also more positive in that it has the idea of being able to live on despite that. Like despite losing everything, they're still happy to be able to live on and see that humanity survived. So yeah, I guess I do. I retract my initial questioning
Yeah.
in that case. And yeah, that's kind of it.
Yeah. So I mean, from a thematic standpoint, I find it interesting the way that they sort of balance the realism, sort of like the emotional realism, and kind of like they kind of go for a semi-grounded sort of science, even though it's sort of fake. But there's also a lot of really fantastical elements, like that fifth episode ending, particularly with like the action sequences really out there. There's certain other sequences that are also really out there, but it doesn't feel too sort of schizophrenic to me. It feels fairly consistent in tone, or not
Yeah,
necessarily in like overall tone, but it doesn't feel like it's a bunch of different works sort of combined. Like the tone changes feel like evolutions over time, like to fit the kind of the state of where they are and like what is needed for the plot. It doesn't feel too disjointed.
hmm.
Well, how do you feel about it?
It's an interesting balance, I think, was what it is, and I think what he was doing is kind of by doing that type of psychological reality, is it gives the actions and the loss and everything else that much more weight.
Hmm.
And I think that is actually, I think that's something that made his stuff much more interesting than what was going on around it. Because like I think a lot of you'll see this in a lot of anime and then a lot of other things is that it's a everything's about just the event to the event to the event, maybe a little bit of character, but the events end up mostly just being kind of as a way of setting up for the next thing to happen.
It's about a plot that they wrote out, which is mostly to drive scenes rather than it being
Yes.
about characters.
Yeah, it's about passing the time and causality and
Well, I mean,
with
like, I
some
mean, if that's what other works tend to do, whereas
yes.
this is,
Whereas this one is that's I mean what I'm saying is that this one's different in that regard.
yeah,
In that or at least not different because I mean there's other works that do something similar, but I think the power of this work and I think of what Evangelion did and why it was such a it's considered a classic is that it was doing that in a way that no one else was really doing at that point. So I think it's a good technique. I mean, it's a difficult balance. I mean, for sure. I mean, being able to do that and having an emotional reality within a strange, um, a strange world like filled with fantastical things because it's hard for us to kind of understand how human psychology would always work under those circumstances.
I think I think we need to sort of separate. Like, I think from the standpoint of the science fiction, I think it's very real to do that because there are a lot of science fiction works that kind of explore that sort of side of things. Like that's kind of the whole point of science fiction is to sort of explore, how attitudes and like how science could change and also how the human psyche fits within the perspective of that. That's kind of the overall point of science fiction to some degree. I think what's most interesting about Gunbuster is the fact that you have that element of that, and sure, they handle it pretty well, I think. But there is also this very overt fantasy element to it as well, in the sense that the character dynamics are very anime.
Mm.
Like, Amano is a very sort of stereotypical character. Noriko,
Yeah, she doesn't get as much. I mean, here's the thing: is like individually, I don't feel like we get a lot of depth to them.
sure.
I
Well, they're
mean, and
very
here's the thing is,
stereotypical.
well, and again, a lot of what we get psychologically is the things that happen to them.
Yeah.
That seems to be a lot of how they're defined, which is usually kind of like a bad way to write or define characters. They at least give Noriko somewhat of a personality thing in that she is just kind of tenacious and will kind of focus inward and try to improve herself in the face of adversity.
Mhm.
But
I mean, they're very stereotypical characters. Yes,
yeah,
that
they don't, there's not a lot of shades of gray going on with them.
they're
I mean,
they're they're they're
I
they're essentially archetypes when you get down to it. I mean, let's be
well, we
honest here.
also have a limited amount of time to spend with them. I kind of felt that like they almost were getting into the idea that Amano felt a certain level of duty to behave a certain way and put on a brave front
Hmm.
for a lot of it, and you saw that breaking down when she goes like, I'm not dumb. I know the coach only has 6 months and things like that, and she still doesn't break down until like that final moment. I thought that was kind of like an interesting thing, and they could kind of have explored that obligation a bit further, but that would have made the series
Hmm.
longer to do so. I mean, again, like sometimes you need that time to build up those moments and a certain level of history and kind of mileage in those characters' shoes to have these kind of changes and tragedies really have full impact.
Right, and what I'm saying, like the archetype thing, is that like they're relatively very straightforward characters. Like they all fit within sort of very base archetypes. Like the fact that they're kind of to some degree just taken outright from another anime, from like the tennis anime. Like
Yeah.
they're fitting
Their
within this sort of
framework has been, yeah.
like, well, I mean, like even like the characters to some degree, like it's like Noriko is the timid girl that is like, oh, but she's got great potential and she'll be hot blooded, type thing. That's her thing, is that she's confident and that's a very sort of like super robot and sort of like shonen type thing of like, hey, you have like you have the confident, brash headed, brash sort of hot blooded type person. You've got the cool headed person, and you have like the rival. You have the older mentor type character. Like these are very sort of broad archetypes, They that often very much feature into things like, say, super robots or mecha shows, and this series kind of takes that and sort of balances that with the fact that we have like the actual plot that's happening to these characters, like the actual emotional stuff, is very atypical. Like it's very not sort of the standard sort of thing of what they would do in like that kind of plot of like a very simple what would have originally been very much for kids sort of characters and storyline, and do something completely different with it. And then they also frame it in the sense like the story is very and the setting is very science fiction heavy, but at the same time we also have this very sort of power fantasy element to it somewhat. Like that last sequence in the episode 5 is sort of it is very much a super robot power fantasy sequence of like, oh,
Well, it's a series of escalating powers and abilities that just wipe out everything.
well, yeah, it's a sense of like, oh, their confidence and their will is being realized, and they can essentially do anything at this point. Like the actuality of how they do it doesn't matter. It's just that they're doing things that are rad, big, and it's very much emotionally connected to, like, say, the music and everything. Of it's a power fantasy. Like there's nothing really scientific or or science fiction necessarily about it. It goes into the realm of pure fantasy at that point. Like if you
Yeah.
notice, they literally have a like a baseball bat and like the robot's shoulders that they don't use. The robot can make a giant baseball bat and hit stuff it wanted to. They didn't do that, but I was there in the technical design. Like it's very a disconnect of like the kind of like, okay, we're going for a sort of harder, it's like sort of science fiction type thing, a Starship Troopers inspired thing. But then they also have this very fantasy sort of like super robot sort of like, you can do anything if you believe in yourself type thing going on. It's an interesting balance, and I think they did it relatively well where it didn't feel too disjointed. That though with the last episode, it was a bit odd that the fifth episode ended with a very fantasy type sequence, and then the sixth episode very much went more into the, okay, very grounded, sort of a very different feel.
Hmm. I feel so. Like, I think that's also maybe why they picked that black and white palette for that.
Sure.
Is they really wanted to sell how much of a feel. I mean, it felt like that last episode was much more. It was more adult
Hmm.
in a lot of ways. Like it didn't have that same kind of power fantasy ending that the fifth episode did, and it was much more about the consequences, and willing to kind of go through with all that type of stuff.
Right.
So I think it was interesting. I thought that it was well directed. I thought it had a lot of different things trying to balance upon itself. It feels a little bit underdeveloped, and I think it's just because this was one of his earlier works. So it didn't really have the same sense of at least narrative or character refinement that he kind of put forward later in his other works after that. Um,
There's some shots in there that feel a bit
Oh, the shots are. I
pointless.
mean, like directorially though, in terms
Sure.
of visually, it's definitely up to snuff. I mean,
Yeah, I mean
like
it's more like
the
there's some
animation
moments
in
where
this.
there's some downtime moments that don't feel like they add all that much. The first few episodes spends a lot of time, like maybe a little too much time on like Noriko's like melancholy, and at the same time, they, like you said, they don't seem to break out the characters into much of like you don't. Despite us spending like 6 episodes with them, like you get sort of a broad stroke feel for their different personalities. But at the same time, like Noriko is like she's a nice girl.
Yeah,
It's kind of like, oh, that's really all that's to her. Like she's a nice young teenage girl. There's not much else to like her like interest wise or anything else, like character wise.
yeah. I mean, that again, like I said, it feels underdeveloped in that regard.
Hmm.
So that's kind of where I was coming from in my criticism there. I mean, and I think it could have been like maybe if it was a bit of a longer series and they could kind of do episodes of kind of breaking down about like where the characters are and why they got to that point. I mean, not to say I want tons of flashbacks, but kind of seeing like maybe how Amano became the way she was. I mean, they imply that she was a lot like Noriko and like that she had to train and work really hard to get there. We never really got into what initially got Amano to be motivated that way and to go through, wearing these metal shoes and climbing up like, hills with it.
Yeah, and I think they could have if they had actually kind of gone for the dichotomy more though of like it's maybe a little
The two
overdone.
characters. I mean, it
I mean,
feels
I
like
meant more
Amano.
if they went for like the archetype, like, or maybe it's a little overdone of like the genius, that's like the natural genius versus the hard effort type thing. But the thing is, like, they established that Noriko is actually a natural genius as well. Like
Yeah,
they work hard, like both of them, but they don't. You don't necessarily get a feeling like they got there by earning it, like
yeah, they don't.
necessarily.
Like,
Like
well, especially
Noriko kind of
Noriko,
gets
it
thrust upon
doesn't.
it because of who her
The coach.
father is.
Yeah, I mean, again, it feel I wish there was things that were more developed, and I think it needed some more time, because otherwise it would have felt, if they had the same runtime and then also address those elements, I think it would be rushed. I mean, even if you took out some of those slower moments that didn't add too much, that's still not enough space to adequately explore like that much further.
And to be fair, also those like slower moments also let the work breathe to some degree. Kind of.
Yes, those were necessary. So that's what I meant. It would have felt crowded.
Yeah.
It would have just not. I mean, so if the show had a longer runtime, it might have been able to. I mean, it's again, I feel like it's a delicate balance. I mean, pacing is one of those things that can really make or break a show in a lot of people's eyes. I mean, like it's kind of like how Fooly Cooley being 6 episodes and like kind of insane worked really well. And if they did more episodes, it would just have gotten tiring.
Oh yeah.
So it's one of those things where you have to judge it out. So again, I think I see a lot of precursors to Ava in this. I mean, quite a bit, and I think that one is kind of like it takes certain things in here, the strengths of this one, and it steps it up a little bit. I mean, also while taking on newer weaknesses in the kind of, I think, psychological instability of the creator in that case, but I think it takes what he does well here and kind of expands upon those. Allowing those quiet moments, having a sense of both the psychological realism within a fantastical world, if that makes any sense. So I think it's definitely worth watching. It's something I thought was really impressive visually for its time period. I like the higher contrast shadows they did throughout this, which you don't really see that much anymore.
I mean, it's a very 80s sort of art style. I mean, this is the type of stuff I love about the 80s. The uh, overuse of inking to some degree, where they kind of use the shadows to sort of make up for drawing where everything is inked to hell. I love that aspect of 80s anime art where it's super
Yeah.
dark. That is the thing I love the most about it. Like the clearly drawn, it's not digital, and they went really hard with the ink all the time, like just really dark. It's great.
Well, it feels distinct, I think, mostly just because contrast, like what we look at now, where things are fairly pastel feeling in comparison.
Hmm.
So, I mean, so I kind of appreciated that kind of, and you see a bit of that, kind of as a nostalgic throwback thing. Like I remember the interstitial things for Gurren Lagann, where you
Hmm.
had that really high contrast shadow thing, was
Yep.
definitely that kind of retro look.
Yep.
So this is, I think, kind of the origin of that what those things throw back to.
I mean, there's
So
a lot of stuff in this work period that feel like a sort of predecessors for stuff they use in Gurren Lagann.
yeah,
Just like thematically, like the stuff against the galaxy type thing. A lot of the sort of power fantasy stuff feels like it's mostly very much sourced to Gunbuster.
also like the self-esteem issues of being, kind of like a the younger person to the older one that you look up to that
Yep.
seems perfect.
I mean, Gurren Lagann, honestly, as a criticism of this, like Gurren Lagann felt like they did the balance of like the talent stuff very much more. Like
Yeah.
the dichotomy that we have here between Noriko and like Amano is not it's not super great. Whereas with the Gurren Lagann with Simon and Kamina, you have a good feel for them, like what how that balance works, and
Well, you
why they're
also
very good
have like
characters.
much more airtime to see that
Absolutely,
contrast play out. I mean, I think
yeah,
that's what it is. You
absolutely.
see it started here, and I think other later shows took those and ran with it more. I think young Freud almost could be. She's such a superfluous. I mean, I don't know what she actually does in this series that does anything. Like I can't. I mean, if you removed her for the most part, I don't know what you'd really be missing in terms of like narrative or anything like that.
I mean, from a narrative standpoint, I don't. I mean, she just kind of serves as a rival character, but though
But that doesn't really, they don't play with that either. Like the rivalry thing is kind of to expose weaknesses and to give something to fight against, but she really just falls into the background so quickly that she ends up almost being superfluous.
I mean,
I'm not saying
I
she's
think
bad, but I'm going like
mm.
I don't know what her purpose
I mean,
is.
she did allow them to do the thing that they did with episode 6, where they had Noriko and Jung out there doing the shit, whereas when Amano was back on Earth, and
I guess, but it does. She didn't really have that much impact for me.
sure, I mean, you know, it's very much you could tell she is sort of the prototype of what they ultimately ended up doing with like Asuka,
Yeah,
but you know, she's not nearly as well developed as a character. No.
yeah, and that's what I mean. Is I think in general they just I think this thing could have done with maybe 2 more episodes.
I don't know. Like if you did 2 more episodes, it feels like it'd be like what would they actually do plot wise in those 2 episodes beyond like the character stuff, like the actual terms of actual events that happen in the plot. Like
Well, I'm thinking about like a little bit of history of those characters and how they got to that point.
sure.
Like because they talk about her being like on the moon and rising to something at such a young age and there's something there they could have explored.
I mean, possibly. I don't know if like showing that actually on screen, like we need a flashback to Jung's backstory would be all that necessary. Like maybe if this was like,
Well, for Young, I
I mean,
mean,
if this was a full
it doesn't work
length,
so much. But I mean, for maybe Amano, it might have given a little bit more about how she became attached to the coach or other, something.
well, he's cool. He's voiced by Norio Wakamoto. I mean, it makes perfect sense. I mean, sure. If it was a longer series in general, I could see that where the show is more a exploration of all you've got there conceptually wise. But given that this OVA is very, every episode is a very specific thing for meeting the overall plot. Not necessarily because a lot of things happen in them, but they're very key and necessary individually for us to get towards the end. Like you
Yeah, I
you
see what you
can't
mean.
lay,
Again,
you couldn't
that's what I
remove
was
any one
talking
of these
about
episodes and
earlier.
actually putting an additional episode in there. I don't think would necessarily improve the core mainline plot at all.
No, but that's not necessarily what I was looking for in terms of like what the padding would be. The padding would be a way of more of the emotional aspect with the characters and the themes and understanding where they're coming from. I mean, again, it's not necessary, but I kind of wish there was a little bit more of that because otherwise it feels underdeveloped. But then again, as we were saying earlier, as I was saying earlier with things like Fully Cooley, you could easily go too far. I mean, honestly, I think it's fine as is. I just felt like there were a couple of areas that there was potential for a little bit more,
Sure.
if that makes sense. So again, I still recommend seeing it. It's definitely it's a product of its time, but not in a bad way.
Yeah.
You hear people say, "Oh, it's a product of its time" as a criticism. I go like, no, it has like certain restrictions and certain aesthetic things that we might find goofy, particularly music wise. Um, but it has some interesting things visually going on, and you can see it as a precursor to a lot.
Mhm.
So I definitely suggest checking it out. Other than that, I think we've covered this one pretty well.
Yep.
So next time we are going to be talking about the amazing world of Gumball. Not no specific episodes because this series is quite long, so we'll just be kind of watching random ones and kind of discussing the series overall. So don't worry about like a viewing list by any means. But then after that, we will be talking about Tatami Galaxy, which I think is available on Hulu.
I believe so. Actually, I think some of the episodes, at least the early ones, are on YouTube. If you want to just take a early look to actually see if that's something that interests you, I think like the first 3 are actually on like Funimation's account.
Yeah, they might be. I think so. Um, so other than that, not much else. You can always reach us at adthepodcast@gmail.com. You can hit me up on Twitter at rymagnuson.
And I'm at SA Zorak.
All right. So we will see you next time.